pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So the first section I'm going to read is about an actual revolutionary, and is from chapter 1 of my book, which is called Wide Awake. Boston, October 1860. On a fine afternoon in the last autumn of the old republic, an ancient man stepped haltingly onto the platform of the Boston and Maine Railroad depot and peered around him with watery eyes. Ralph Farnham was 104 years old, but besides this extraordinary achievement, he had, at least since young manhood, led an unremarkable life. He had boarded the train that morning near the small farm in southern Maine from whose steep and stony fields he had eked out his subsistence for the past 80 years. Like thousands of other hard-scrabble New England farmers, old Uncle Farnham, as all his neighbors called him, woke every day before dawn, went to bed at dusk, and in the hours between lived a life that varied only according to the demands of the changing seasons. He had not been to Boston in many, many years. Now, squinting into the shadowy dimness of the station, he could see figures moving all around him, feel them clasping his hands, hear them calling his name. "Give us your hat, sir," someone close by cried out, and as he uncertainly proffered it toward whoever had spoken, he felt it grow suddenly heavier in his grasp as coins were dropped in from all sides, weighting it with silver and even gold. As news of his arrival rippled through the crowd, the cheers grew louder, echoing up and down the length of the cavernous train shed, and even from the sunlit square beyond, "Hurrah! Hurrah for the last hero of Bunker Hill." Old Uncle Farnham did not tell them, had he tried to, would anyone have listened, that he had not actually fought at Bunker Hill, had not even fired a shot, having simply watched from a mile's distance as a green 18-year-old recruit, while the smoke of the Minutemen's volleys drifted across Charlestown Neck. Ever since a Boston paper had discovered his existence that summer, as if he were one of Mr. Barnum's rare beasts, the writers had embellished his military career more and more, until, as they would tell it, he had practically fended off General Howe's grenadiers single-handed. And what of it? People wanted revolutionary heroes, and old Uncle Farnham would oblige them. He would even, at their insistence, get on a train and come to Boston. It seemed suddenly so important to everybody. Indeed, all across the country that autumn, Americans were almost desperate for heroes, old or new, and for a renewed connection to their glorious past. The quickly dwindling ranks of General Washington's comrades in arms seemed to herald a larger loss. It was as though the last faint rays of the nation's sunny youth were disappearing into the horizon. Over the past few decades, more and more Americans had come to share a sense that the nation's leaders, and even its common citizens, had declined shamefully since the founding era, a race of giants giving way to dwarfish petty politicians and shopkeepers. As early as 1822, 19-year-old Ralph Waldo Emerson, writing to his brother on the eve of Independence Day, quipped cynically that his countrymen had marched forward since the Revolution to strength, to honor, and at last, to ennui. In fact, the nation's antebellum political leaders were trimmers and compromisers by necessity. Men like John Tyler and Franklin Pierce, and even those with more glowing names such as Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, and Stephen Douglas, struggled to keep the fragile Union of States together at almost any price. "We can win no laurels in a war for independence," Webster once admitted. "Earlier and worthier hands have gathered them all, but to us remains the great duty of defense and preservation." Charles Francis Adams put it more succinctly, "It is for us to preserve and not to create." Yet, despite the best efforts of these skillful preservationists, the country was changing fast. The land of Ralph Farnham's youth, and even that of his middle age at the beginning of the current century, had been a very different America. In those days, the tiny cabin that he had built with his own hands, of logs felled from the surrounding forest, stood in the middle of an almost virgin wilderness, country so rough that only the poorest and most desperate pioneers settled there. Books and newspapers never reached him. Clocks and watches were virtually unknown. A man guessed the time of day by looking at the sun. Neighbors, that is, anyone within 10 miles, were rarely seen. A journey of even a short distance meant hiking through the woods along tenuous pathways and old Indian trails. When General Washington first ran for president, Farnham had walked all day to reach the nearest town and cast a ballot for his old commander. Life had been hard in those days, but independence was something tangible and real. Now, the little wooden farmhouse looked out not over endless waves of treetops, but on a deforested valley of cornfields, orchards, and prosperous villages. The fast-flowing streams that fed the Great East Lake were lined with sawmills, grist mills, even a few large factories. In the nearby towns were ingenious devices that he would never have dreamed of even 20 years before. Not long before the Boston trip, a man had shown up at the farmhouse and asked to take his likeness with one of the new photographic machines. The old soldier assented, put on his best suit of clothes, and sat up very straight and dignified, holding his walking stick tight to steady himself as the big lens fixed his image forever on a sheet of glass. And I was really excited to actually have this image and be able to get it for the book. This incredible glass plate negative photograph that, it's like these 1860s photographs are so amazing. They're so high res, not a word they would have used at the time, but if you get a high res image on your computer, you can zoom in and zoom in and zoom in till literally with this one you can see the stubble on Ralph Farnham's 104-year-old chin, if you want to. I did. Visits from strangers were no longer much of a surprise anyway. His once remote hillside was now connected to the rest of the world. Any day might bring news or callers. When Farnham had first settled his land, not a single newspaper was published in all of Maine. Now there were almost 70, copying the latest dispatches from across the nation and even from overseas. The railroad passed within a few miles of his front door. He could leave home in the morning and arrive in Boston just after lunch, or in Washington the following day. But such a journey still would have seemed to him nearly as fanciful as flying to the moon. He hadn't even been to Boston since he'd marched there with Captain Hubbard's militia back in the spring of 1775. Okay, that's the section on generation number 1. And now I'll go along to generation number 2, which is the sort of the intermediate generation, the antebellum generation, the generation that I call the Old Gentleman, which is the title of chapter 2 of my book. And this story actually takes place here in Washington, D.C. A lot of the book actually happens in Washington, both because it was a center of so much action at the time, but also because I think it's where I wrote the book, and I just felt so much of the sort of tug historically of this place, walking down the steps of the Jefferson building when I left it in the evenings, and seeing the Capitol right in front of me, seeing the steps where Lincoln gave his first inaugural address, seeing the field where the early recruits who came to Washington played baseball under the chestnut trees, and just feeling the tug of that history, I think really informed the book. So this is Washington, January 1861. It might have seemed an unusual transaction, hardly in the common line of business for a big auction house like Green and Williams, with its commodious premises just off Pennsylvania Avenue, halfway between the White House and the Capitol. The partnership's stock in trade ran more to real estate, furniture, and kitchenware. These were the sorts of valuables that the capital city's transient denizens often left behind as the ever-evolving wheel of congressional elections and presidential administrations, the waxing and waning of political parties, regularly returned large numbers of inhabitants to the far-flung provinces from which they had so recently arrived. Still, the potential commission on this sale was tempting, since it might well prove substantial. A Negro male, just past the prime of life, could fetch $1,000, the price of a modest house and lot in the city. And the one now on offer was no common field hand, but a first-rate house servant. If a sharp-eyed speculator or two attended the sale, the price might go even higher. Shipped down to the New Orleans market, this fellow could bring as much as $1,500, or at least close to it, even if his eventual master only intended to put him to work cutting sugarcane. A newcomer to Washington that winter might have been surprised, even shocked, to see a slave put on the block here in broad daylight. This was, after all, 1861. Hadn't the slave trade in the District of Columbia been abolished more than a decade earlier as part of the Compromise of 1850? Indeed, it had been heralded at the time as the South's most important concession to the North. For decades, abolitionists have been wailing about the moral stain of human traffic here in the capital of the Republic. Their propaganda broadsides had shown coffles of black men and women, shackled together, being marched past the domed Capitol itself. Now, that was all supposed to be a thing of the past. Few people, at least outside of Washington, noticed that the 1850 law did not actually prohibit slave trading itself. It simply banned anyone from bringing Negroes into the District of Columbia for the purpose of selling them out of state. That took care of those embarrassing coffles. Washington would no longer be a major entrepot for Negroes being shipped off to the slave-hungry Cotton Belt from the overstocked Chesapeake region. But it was still perfectly legal for a Washingtonian to put his house servant up for public auction, and even to advertise the offering, as Green and Williams did, in the pages of the Daily National Intelligencer, the city's leading newspaper and a semi-official chronicler of congressional proceedings. If the unlucky slave happened to turn up the following week in one of the Alexandria slave pens right across the Potomac, ready to be packed onto to a New Orleans-bound schooner, well, that too was perfectly within the law. The Negro coming up for sale on this particular occasion was a 33-year-old man named Willis. Selling him might even be called a prestige transaction for Green and Williams, which, though large, was by no means known as one of the more genteel auction houses in the capital. For this slave had been, as the firm boasted in its advertisement, the valued property of the late Honorable George M. Bibb, deceased, one of the district's most distinguished longtime residents. The courtly, white-haired Judge Bibb, also known, depending on whom you spoke to, as Chancellor Bibb, Senator Bibb, Secretary Bibb, had been a fixture of Washington politics and society ever since his arrival as a young senator from Kentucky during President Madison's first term. As his respectful obituaries noted, he had been at various times United States Attorney, Secretary of the Treasury under President Tyler, and after retiring from government service and taking up practice as a leading Washington attorney, an habitué of the U.S. Supreme Court chamber. In his politics, the late judge had been admirably moderate, both a pro-slavery man and a Union man in the hallowed tradition of his native Virginia. His most notable speech in the Senate had been back in 1833, when South Carolina had threatened to secede over nullification, one of those almost ceaseless sectional crises and compromises that had preoccupied the federal government throughout recent decades. "My voice is still for peace," Bibb sonorously began, and then spent 3.5 hours professing his belief in peace and the Union and peace. A speech so worthy and so boring, one newspaper noted, that by the time it concluded, every living creature in the Senate chamber, with the exception of the satisfied orator himself, had either fallen asleep or fled. This is not to say that the late Judge Bibb had been a drab figure. Indeed, he was well known around town for his distinctive ways. Until the end of his life, he clung steadfastly to the fashions of Jefferson's day: silk stockings, buckled knee breeches, and a ruffled white cravat. People saw him, sighed sentimentally, and knew beyond all doubt that they were gazing upon a true gentleman of the old school. The judge was an accomplished musician. His Georgetown neighbors were used to strolling past his fine brick house on a warm evening and hearing the strains of his violin through the open study windows. Then one spring, the violin was heard no more. By the way, that house still stands in Georgetown, and when I was writing this passage, I was lucky enough I started doing some poking around online and found that the house was actually up for sale. So I went to Realtor.com and went like room by room through Judge Bibb's house. It's, there's some great stuff you can get at the Library of Congress and some that you can't, so that was really cool. As for Willis the Negro, he had been for some years the old gentleman's trusted body servant. It had been he who neatly laid out the silk stockings and knee breeches each morning, who put the violin away in its case, who shaved the grizzled jowls and attended faithfully by the bed during his master's final illness. On the afternoon of the funeral, it was he who prepared refreshments for the distinguished mourners gathered in the judge's parlor, including President Buchanan and most of his cabinet. Perhaps it was a bit unseemly for a fine family like the Bibbs to advertise their loyal household retainer for sale in the public prints, and then to make poor Willis stand on the block at that shabby auction house as Messrs. Green and Williams hovered assiduously, pointing out his finer qualities to whoever cared to look. As a man approaching middle age, Willis may well have had a wife and children, perhaps members of the district's large free Negro community, who would be heartbroken if he were sold south. But then, what use had the widow Bibb for a gentleman's valet? Manumission was out of the question. Had not the late judge himself often declared his staunch opposition to the practice, calling free blacks a nuisance to society? There were estate taxes to think of, too. The deceased had left no fewer than 17 children, and how, pray tell, was a Negro to be divided 17 ways? Wasn't the sale perfectly legal? Wouldn't the good people of Washington in any event forget the matter quickly, remembering the late Honorable Judge George M. Bibb as a selfless public servant, a kindly neighbor, an honest gentleman? Money, in the end, was money. So the advertisement appeared in the Intelligencer for one Negro man named Willis, about 33 years of age, and a slave for life. Below that, a shorter line of type, also one gold watch. So now I'll read the final short section. This is also said in Washington, and this is about the arrival of this newer and younger generation en masse right here in the Capitol. Washington, May 1861. During the first days of May, an unusual sight greeted visitors to the Capitol. In the great rotunda beneath the interrupted dome, young men in gray and red uniforms and fezzes swung like merry acrobats from ropes and shimmied up pillars. They capered over the muddy grounds, one observer wrote, leaping fences, knocking down sentinels, turning aside indignant bayonets, hanging like monkeys from the outer ledges of the dome some 200 feet above the firm-set earth. Those staid classical halls had witnessed some strange things already that year. The rancorous scenes to which they had long since become accustomed, Northerners thundering against Southerners, slaveholders denouncing abolitionists, torrents of Baroque invective relieved only by occasional fistfights, had yielded suddenly to an unprecedented calm. But now, just weeks later, There was neither tranquility nor rancor here. Rather, it might have seemed at first glance that a flying circus had invaded the Capitol. Like the nation itself, the Capitol building was a work in progress that spring. Several years earlier, a forward-thinking Southern statesman had directed an ambitious expansion project, spreading the marble wings across their hilltop, ready to encompass all the delegations and committees, offices, and bureaus that the rapidly growing federal union might require. To maintain proper scale, an architect was engaged to remove the old low-rise curve of the roof and replace it with a soaring new dome of cast iron, as serenely presumptuous in its grandiosity as a Natchez cotton planter's mansion or a Newport railroad baron's cottage. Then, lawmakers busied themselves with deciding what kind of statue should crown the new structure. Taking a break from their debates over Kansas and slavery, they found a rare moment of bipartisan accord. The nation's temple of democracy must be topped with a heroic statue of freedom, that amiable and versatile goddess. But when the sculptor presented his plaster model, sectional strife erupted again. On her head, the figure wore a pallias, the Roman cap of liberty, a conventional bit of allegory. But the Southern politician who had taken such interest in the work, a man with a fine classical education, knew that the pallias had been used in ancient times to denote a slave who had been freed by his master. The gentleman, Jefferson Davis, then serving as Secretary of War, protested lest such a blatant symbol of abolitionism should crown the very pinnacle of the Republic. Now, the statue, her objectionable liberty cap, replaced by a politically innocuous, if allegorically dubious, Roman helmet, lay in pieces yet to be assembled at a Maryland bronze foundry. And Freedom's casting was being overseen there by an expert metalworker, a slave named Philip Reed. The Capitol dome itself rose half-finished, wooden scaffolding and an enormous crane jutting up above its open shell, which seemed to hang in the balance between creation and destruction. Sage minds reflected that it symbolized the incomplete and imperiled nation itself. The metaphor, if not the building, was satisfyingly perfect. Walt Whitman, although he had little use for the Statue of Freedom, deriding it as an extensive female cast in bronze with much drapery, especially ruffles, loved the incomplete Capitol and suggested it be left perpetually as it was, with the derrick crane a more poetical emblem of the Republic than Davis's statue. What, though, was the meaning of the sight, to say nothing of the sounds and the smells that greeted visitors in May? No poetical explanations came immediately to mind. In corridors off the rotunda, statues of lawmakers and patriots trembled precariously on their pedestals as hordes of young rowdies raced past. When a sentry tried to block a group from entering an off-limits area, they rolled him down the Capitol steps. In the House of Representatives, they play-acted a session of Congress, in the course of which they elected a speaker, clerk, and other officers, went into full session, dissolved the Union, and reconstructed it. In the Senate, invaders quickly found the desk that until recently had been occupied by Jefferson Davis, still bearing a placard with his name neatly inked. A distraught custodian arrived to find the young men hacking it to pieces with their bayonets, and feebly protested that it was the property not of the Confederate traitor, but of the federal government that they had just pledged their lives to defend. Ignoring him, the young men divvied up the wooden fragments as souvenirs. These were the 1,000 soldiers of the 1st New York Fire Zouaves, who, through the infinite wisdom of military authorities, had been bivouacked in the Capitol upon their arrival in Washington 2 days before. They had landed in a city already teeming with soldiers, so many, one newspaper man reflected, that its customarily drab streets at last resembled in at least one respect the imperial capitals of Paris, Vienna, and St. Petersburg. Every third man you passed wore some sort of gaudy uniform. Everywhere, too, particularly in the grandest public buildings, was the stench of unwashed bodies and fresh piss. Troops bunked on makeshift cots among filing cabinets and display cases in the patent office, even in the East Room of the White House, 20 feet directly below President President Lincoln's desk. Several different regiments quartered in the Capitol. Soldiers slept under congressmen's desks by night, by day drilled hourly before the East Front, in the intervening hours stretched out on the young grass beneath the horse chestnut trees, heavy with pink-white blossoms in the burgeoning spring. Sometimes they played baseball on the lawn where weeks earlier crowd gathered to see Mr. Lincoln give his inaugural address. How distant that seemed now. At night, recalled one New York private, the crimson and gold house chamber reverberated with the rhythmic breathing of 1,000 sleepers until the drums beat reveille at dawn, when the din of rambunctious voices began again, unceasing until dusk. The irony of his location was not lost on this thoughtful recruit, Theodore Winthrop, a poet and travel writer of some repute, who had joined up with the New York 7th and who was now hunched over a lamp in one corner of the hall, penning a dispatch to the Atlantic Monthly. Our presence here was the inevitable sequel of past events, he wrote. We appeared with bayonets and bullets because of the bosh uttered on this floor, because of the bills with treasonous stump speeches in their bellies passed here, because of the cowardice of the poltroons, the imbecility of the dodgers, and the arrogance of the bullies who had here cooperated to blind and corrupt the minds of the people. Talk had made a miserable mess of it. He scoffed at the departed congressman as belonging already to that bygone epoch of our country when men shaved the mustache, dressed like parsons, said "sir," and chewed tobacco, supplanted now in their own inner sanctum by a bolder and more colorful generation. Thank you.
Make all the demons quiet, yeah. We were built to thrive, yeah. I think that we've all had enough. What keeps you up at night, yeah. Make all the demons quiet, yeah. We were built to thrive, yeah. I think that we've all had enough. Oh yeah, I think that we've all had enough. Sick of dealing with the old plan. They know that we're calling them wrong. You got me like, oh yeah, I think that we've all had enough. It's too late to try to go contain it. A generation fueled by creation. We live lives on a small screen nation. We control the airwaves, no negotiation. I refuse to think we need saving. Something good will come from creation. And when we think that the world is too anxious, we'll adapt, evolve, survive, and save it. What keeps you up at night, yeah. Make all the demons quiet, yeah. We were built to thrive, yeah. I think that we've all had enough. What keeps you up at night, yeah. Make all the demons quiet, yeah. We were built to thrive, yeah.